Welcome everyone that are joining us at the moment. We're just going to wait a couple of seconds, give people a chance to get in here, and then we'll start the program. So welcome everyone, Leslie Lampton here. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Ridgefield Library and to let you know that this program is co-sponsored by the Norwalk River Watershed Association and the Ridgefield Pollinator Pathway. And this is actually part of a new series that we're getting going. So we have another program coming up on March the 11th. And Jackie Algan will be talking then about invasives and how to get rid of them, just in time for the spring. So I would like to welcome Cathy Smith. Cathy has lived in Wilton for around 20 years and she's been gardening for way more than that, I believe. She is involved with the Norwalk River Watershed Association and the Norwalk River Valley Trail and also the Pollinator Pathway as well. So please welcome Cathy Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. And I just wanted to say how happy I am to be here tonight to talk about soundscape ecology and how you can actually welcome the voices of nature to your yard. As Leslie said, I'm on the board of the Norwalk River Watershed Association. Just a quick mention about that group. We're focused on preserving and protecting the Norwalk River, its tributaries, and all of the habitat around it. And we do that through education and action. And one of the sort of main focuses of our action is actually to help create green corridors or pollinator pathways by removing invasive plants and planting native ones and encouraging people to avoid the pesticides. So for those of you who are already on the pollinator pathway or interested in native plants, a lot of the tips that I'm going to give you will sound familiar. So there's a lot of overlap in things that you can do just to welcome pollinators as well as to welcome all of the animals out there and insects and birds that actually produce this beautiful chorus of nature. So let me just move into the talk. So I am going to talk about sounds and the soundscape and what that is, and also going to focus on why sounds and what we hear and listen to really matters, and maybe now more than ever. I'm going to talk about the soundscape and why it, as we become more and more removed in a way or disconnected from the sounds of the natural world, we become disconnected from a key part of that sense of belonging to what is our kind of our natural home. So there are really profound implications to the sounds that nature makes and our ability to tune into them or not. And there's a really fascinating new field called soundscape ecology that focuses on the sounds that the landscape makes, hence soundscapes. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that and why that's important. And then I'm going to, for the last part of it, talk about ways that you can actually encourage the sounds of nature to come into your yard or garden or wherever it is that you live. It was funny, I was just walking up here to get ready for the talk and I heard a really loud barred owl right outside my window. And that was a lovely sight to listen to. So let me get started. I have done this talk a few times and I've just been reading this wonderful book just right now by Terry Tempest Williams. If you don't know her, I really highly recommend her. She's a wonderful writer about nature and the natural world. And she, this quote that I found from her in the library, and hang on 1 minute, I'm going to get rid of those boxes. Great. It really struck me because it had so much to do with sound and the sounds of nature. And I'm going to let you read that for a second. I'm just going to play a few sounds of Canada geese, which are probably all too familiar to many of us, maybe not so welcome. But for me, being from Canada, maybe originally, there's sort of something primal about them. So the reason that this quote really got to me was, first of all, the sense that so often what we hear is one of the first perceptions we have about a situation or a landscape or anything, any situation that we're in. And sometimes the way that it shapes our consciousness is sort of imperceptible and inexplicable. But I really like this idea she has of just allowing our windows to be always open. Of course, we can't always have them open here. She lives in the West, the Southwest, so that's a little more possible for her. But the idea of opening our windows and welcoming in wildness. And when we do that, wildness enters our home. And I sort of want to take it a little bit further and think not just about opening our windows, but having our ears and maybe our souls always open and open to the sounds of nature and to nature itself, and to let that wildness and let that nature enter us and allow us to be reconnected again with this natural home that we actually evolved from. So I particularly love this quote, and I again really recommend this book and any others by Terry Tempest Williams. So you may wonder why I'm talking to you about soundscape ecology. I am not a soundscape ecologist, but I've been really fascinated by nature ever since I was a little child. And I luckily have this little memento of my childhood, and it was a picture that was actually taken at a really kind of seminal moment in a way in the formation of my love of nature. And I'm from Canada originally, as I think I already mentioned. I was about 5 years old here, I think, and I was just recovering from encephalitis. And my father, fortunately, was a doctor, so he was able to look after me, but I was quite sick. And when I recovered from that, a girl from a local cabin, because we were in a fairly remote area of New Brunswick in Atlantic Canada, she wanted to sort of welcome me back to the world of the living. And she brought this bullfrog to me. And I became fascinated by the frog and pretty much everything it did, including the sounds that it made. And I'm just going to briefly play this little tape. Now, there is also the sound of a green frog in there, but that plump sound of the bullfrog was really riveting to me. And you may actually have an opportunity to hear green frogs, bullfrogs, and we'll talk about other frogs later. They're one of the wonderful voices of nature that we can welcome to our yards. And there's things that we can do to pretty much ensure that they'll be there. And I can probably guarantee you that they're probably there already. But this also makes me think a little bit about sound and memory and how important sound is to our sense memories. There was, Proust and his Madeleine. And so for many of us, sounds really can immediately summon up a time in our past. It could be music, or it could be the sounds of the natural world. I can think of things in my childhood, the sound of mourning doves cooing outside my window. I remember the very strong sensation once many years ago of driving through the Great Dismal Swamp in North Carolina and hearing the spring peepers that were deafening. So again, sound evokes a lot of things, emotion, and it can also really help sort of bring memories to the surface. So sound is really important in the sounds of the natural world in the way that we relate to the world and to ourselves and our own histories. So it would be difficult to talk about sound and nature without, of course, talking about Rachel Carson. I'm sure many of you know her work. Her book, The Silent Spring, which was published in 1962, I think, was just this really important work. She was a wonderful writer and a scientist, and her observations of the sounds of nature, or actually the absence of sounds, particularly in the form of the birds and songbirds in spring, ultimately led to her publishing this book, and really ultimately led to the banning of DDT, which had been responsible for endangering so many birds, bald eagles, ospreys, songbirds. So sound was really important to her, and the absence of sound really sort of cued her into this big problem out there. Suddenly there were no birds singing, and then what a sad world that would be. So one of the current scientists working in the field of soundscape ecology is a professor from Purdue University named Brian Pijanowski. And he and his mentor, who I'll be talking about later, is a man named Bernie Krause, are sort of the fathers or are very important figures in this field of soundscape ecology. And they're very focused on the idea of that connection of ourselves, of human beings to nature through the sounds that we hear. And one little note about talking about, I'm going to be using the words nature and natural world quite a bit tonight. And these days, a lot of people in ecology are actually questioning the use of those words in a way, because when we differentiate ourselves from the natural world, that division is probably one of the things that has helped create a lot of the problems environmentally that we find ourselves in. So I will be using the words nature and the natural world. They mean something to me, but it's worth thinking about when we think about dichotomies like that and how they might actually affect our thinking. So when I first started working on this talk, and I've been sort of mulling over writing a book about it because it really matters so much to me, it was actually before COVID-19 hit. And then the first time I gave this talk, it was supposed to be in person, and it ended up being by Zoom because by that point, it was, I think, toward the end of March, we were no longer having in-person events. And I started noticing that there were headlines everywhere and stories about people reconnecting with nature, and specifically about people feeling that they could hear nature more loudly. And there was a lot of discussion and writing about whether nature was indeed louder or whether it's just so quiet and maybe we were listening a little more clearly. Lots of stories about reconnecting with nature through gardening as well. And during lockdown, there was one writer who I mentioned, who I read, who had lived in Paris and said that she'd heard songbirds for the first times in years. Same thing, someone writing from New York City. And then there's this wonderful, the third quote is a man named Chris Watson. He's a sound recordist and a really important in the field of recording the sounds of nature, which many of which are endangered, the soundscapes. He actually does the sound for most of David Attenborough's documentaries. If you haven't seen those, are wonderful. Probably most of you have, about the natural world. But he noted, he lives in England, that he felt since COVID that he was hearing the blackbirds in his yard. And the blackbirds in England are lovely caroling birds that sort of fill sort of a similar niche to our robins. And he felt that they were singing more vigorously and in more sort of diverse ways. And he surmised that because of the quiet, the blackbirds had more competition that was audible to the female songbirds, and they really kind of had to up their game to be more attractive to the females. So just another sort of impact of COVID and the quiet that has come to the world in many ways, although the sound is starting to return. But it has caused a lot of people to think about noise pollution as one of the forms of pollution that really kind of threatens the world and other species as well as ourselves. So talking about noise pollution, it actually turns out that, that's been an issue for a long time. There was a wonderful article in the Atlantic about a year ago called "Why Everything is Getting Louder" by a woman named Bianca Bosker. And she she says the earliest noise complaint in history was actually in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh being the Mesopotamian mythological hero. And within that story, the gods become so angry with mankind that they decide they're going to send this huge flood, one of the flood myths, to destroy us. And the reason that they were so angered was because of the enormous noise and uproar we made. So one can only imagine that if those gods are still around up there, what they must be thinking now about the noise that we as humans are making in the 21st century. And it turns out that, well, not surprisingly, of course, we get louder, and we've certainly gotten louder since the time of Gilgamesh. Pollution, it is estimated, doubles or triples even every 30 years or so. And the National Park Service and the EPA have done studies of sound, and they actually haven't done, I believe, this complete one since sometime in the 80s. But they estimate not only that the sound and noise pollution expands so rapidly, but also that over 145 million Americans are actually exposed to sound that exceeds the recommended limit, which can not only do damage to your hearing, but also, as most of us know, really loud noises can be quite disturbing and stressful. And of course, not surprisingly, sound pollution affects people in less affluent communities a lot more than those of us in less affluent, more than those of us in more affluent communities. So that's probably not too surprising, since pollution in general has that effect. So one of the maps that they actually presented, I think they presented this in around 2015, and I'll be showing you another one too. This one showed the loudest and quietest spots in the US, and it included human sounds as well as natural sounds. And at the top of that legend, you can see the yellowish sounds are the loudest, and the darker blues are the quietest. And it's really quite remarkable to see all of the noise that occurs on the East Coast, and only a little bit sort of along the edges of the West Coast. And of course, this is human generated sound significantly. But another thing to note is that sound and natural sound, which is included in this, is greater in areas where there is more greenery, more plant life, and more wetland and wet humidity. So you can see that the darkest areas, the quietest areas, are actually out in the open desert. And we'll be coming back to water and sound a little bit later. So I think it's worth thinking about just for a moment about the difference between sound and noise. And I think very often we tend to use them as synonyms, but really noise is a kind of sound, and it's a sound generally that is unwanted. I think very often we think of noise as having to be loud, but if you think about sounds that have bothered you in your life, quite often it's not necessarily that they're loud. It's that they're repetitive, that they maybe are slightly chaotic or jarring. And very often it's because they're uncontrollable. If you've ever had, say, a fire alarm go off in your house, sometimes they're not particularly loud, but you can't control them, and it's just incessant, repetitive, and it's can be stress inducing. And of course, it's often in the ear of the beholder. If you think about music, I think about growing up in my own household. I had brothers who were into really heavy metal, and I was sort of a folky, and boy, I really thought that their music was noise and mine was just beautiful sound. So it's worth thinking a little bit about the difference between sound and noise. And also, just while we're on that sort of differentiating words, to think a little bit about hearing versus listening. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. Hearing really being a more passive thing, and listening being something that requires a little more engagement and mindfulness, you might say. So how does noise actually affect wildlife? Because it certainly doesn't just affect us. And I've already alluded to this in previous slides, particularly with reference to COVID. There's been a lot of research done and studies done on the topic. And for, one example is that birds that are living in areas that are particularly noisy in industrial areas, they tend to have fewer offspring than those that are in quieter habitats. There was also an interesting study done that showed that birds, if they had any choice at all, would nest away a certain distance away from a road or a highway. And there were many more nests and bird nesting activity found the further you got away from a road, a noisy road. It also turns out that birds tend to make screechier, sort of louder and screechier sounds when they're in noisy environments. One person compared the difference being a song sparrow in a quiet environment sounding more like George Clooney, but in a noisy environment, maybe a little bit more like Brad Simpson. Sorry, it's not Brad Simpson, but anyway. The Simpsons, maybe Homer. So anyway, stress levels also in animals, in mammals. Bart, I just remembered it. Okay, it was one of those senior moments. Stress levels I found in other animals really have rise when things like skidoos or snowmobiles arrive on the scene, and the levels diminish when those machines leave. They've also found this with ship traffic in the North Atlantic. It has had quite an effect on right whales. And so it also affects, species diversity and populations. Birds often tend to have fewer young in noisier areas. And it's thought that it could be because of the stress and maybe problems that produces in immunity, that they have to expend more energy singing longer and more loudly and less perhaps on gathering food. A really fascinating story is one of Bernie Krause, who's the father again of Soundscape Ecology, who lives in California. And he had gone out one spring to record the sounds of frogs in Mono Lake. And when he arrived, it was so loud, and he was sort of under the impression that it was almost because there were so many frogs and they were singing in unison. It was as if there was like one enormous frog singing. And then what happened was that it turned out the military was testing jets over the area. So when a jet would fly overhead, it was so loud that it would totally throw the frogs out of sync. And after the jet had passed by, it took 45 minutes for the frogs to get back into unison. And during that 45 minutes, they saw a coyote, a couple of great horned owls, and others sort of scoop in, because now those predators could actually hear the individual frogs. So they were able to pick off the frogs far more effectively when the frogs weren't singing in unison. And actually, it turns out to have had an impact over the long-term numbers of frogs in that area. So noise has, a human-generated noise in particular, does have a huge effect on birds and animals, and not just humans. But of course, it affects us too. You probably don't need to be told that there's a lot of research on the effect of stress, on the effect of sound on humans and on their stress levels. And I'd like to mention this little anecdote. I was putting this presentation together, and I was early one morning last spring, and I was listening to some of the birds outside. It was just lovely and quiet. And then the landscaping crew for the people who had fairly recently moved in across the street arrived, and it was like a sonic assault. And I felt myself, I could sort of check off most of these things on the list, not all of them, thankfully, but stress levels increased. My heart started beating faster. I just found myself much less able to focus. I felt really annoyed and kind of anxious. And it turns out too that if these noise happens over a long term, it can lead to things like cardiovascular disorders. Not always, but it can. There was an interesting study done in New York City, in a school in New York City, where the back of the school, and so some of the classrooms backed on a pretty loud train line. And the trains would come by approximately every 4.5 minutes. And every time that happened, the sound level was almost as loud as, say, a loud rock concert. The teacher would either have to start yelling or stop talking, and then it would take a long time for the children to get their attention back to what they were studying. And this study found over time that the students who had their classrooms on the other side of the school were about 11 months ahead in their learning as the kids who were learning in the classrooms right next to the train line. So noise has a pretty profound effect on us too, obviously. But it turns out that, on the other hand, natural sounds and nature's chorus can have a really wonderful, life-affirming, healthful effect on us. Obviously, some of the sounds are just beautiful. They make us feel better. They can calm us. I think it actually can help you when you start to listen to sounds in nature, really hone your senses. And it really is, listening to nature and just listening in general is a mindfulness exercise. It'd probably behoove all of us right now to be better listeners in general, not just to the natural world, but to each other. It promotes biophilia, which is a wonderful term. It was sort of popularized by E.O. Wilson, the scientist whose field of expertise is actually ants. He's a professor emeritus, I believe, now at Harvard, and he's written many wonderful books about biodiversity and biophilia. And biophilia is the idea that we as humans just have this innate tendency to be attracted to the natural world and to living things. So when we hear and open our ears to the sounds of nature, it really connects us in a way that's kind of natural, since we grew up and evolved with them around us. And it can really help enhance, I think, our respect for nature as well. And in addition to that, in addition to it being healthful for us, the more sounds of nature that you actually hear outside your window or in a specific environment, the more biodiverse and the healthier the environment is around you. The soundscape can tell an amazing story about the natural world that surrounds you, not just about its health, but about many, many other things. So I invite you now for a second or two to think maybe about what sounds you hear outside your windows, or if you step outside your door, and how do those sounds vary between, early morning or night, between summer and winter, when it's raining or when it's really dry out. Lots of sounds that you can hear outside of your window, and maybe what do they make you think? And so when I was doing this presentation in the early spring, I liked to segue into the sound of spring peepers, which we'll still hear at the end of this. But right now, what I've been hearing, particularly outside my window, lots of birds, but particularly this little fellow, Carolina wren. I'll just let you listen for a second. You can also hear a cardinal joining in the serenade there. They're around all year, but they, at least around me, tend to be a lot more omnipresent around this time of year. They seem to come out from the woods and be serenading me. And it's really quite a nice sound to hear, especially in the middle of winter. So let's talk a little bit about soundscape. The soundscape, again, it's a sound that the landscape around you produces, all of those sounds. It's really all of the sounds that you can hear in a particular moment of time. And soundscape ecologists divide sounds up into 3 different categories. One of them, the first they call geophony, which are the sounds that the natural world that is inanimate makes. So it's rain, it's a tree falling, it's the sound of wind, it's the sound of a rock slide, it's the sound of a burbling brook. That's geophony. The next category of sound is biophony, and that is the music or the sounds that non-human organisms make. And we're really going to be focusing primarily on that category during this talk. So it's the birds, the bees, the amphibians, and again, we'll be talking about that. The third category is anthrophony, which are the sounds that we humans make. And I certainly don't want to leave the impression that I think, or soundscape ecologists think, that humans only produce unpleasant noise. Obviously, we produce gorgeous sounds, beautiful music. There's nothing like the sound of laughing children or just somebody that you love, the voice of someone you love. So not to say that all sounds that humans produce are noise or unpleasant, but we do, we have to admit, we are responsible for a lot of noise that is excessive and loud and uncontrollable, and has, it turns out, ill effects on us and on our cohabitants of the planet Earth. So this is an image, obviously nowhere around here. It's just giving you the idea of what might be included in a soundscape, you know, birds, the biophony, human voices, the anthrophony, and waves and wind. That's the geophony. So just to start thinking a little bit about the kinds of sounds that you're hearing when you're listening outside your window or when you're outdoors. So specifically today, we're going to focus on how you can help attract birds. And these are just a few pictures of some of our local avian denizens. And I'm just going to briefly play, I'm not going to play all of them, but I'm going to play, first of all, the sound of a bluebird. So for any of you who are bird watchers, you'll recognize that sound. And they make many other sounds as well, but that's a particularly lovely sound. It's really quite sweet natured, like bluebirds seem to be. And then we have the sound of the barred owl, and they make a lot of sounds too. This one is really odd. And I will say, the first time I heard that particular sound, I was frozen in my tracks. I'd never heard it before. It can be quite loud. They do make quite a number of other sounds as well, but that's a barred owl. And you'll see there in the middle a barred owl that was taken outside of my window last year, I think it was. He's sitting on the end of a lawnmower. And he was quite around quite a bit that year. So I'm just going to move on because I see that we're starting to sort of run a bit short on time. So I'm going to go past the other birds, but you'll see there are a lot of birds that will come to your yard if you will do a lot of the things that that I'm going to recommend to you later on. Then in addition to birds, there are the insects out there, and there's different kinds of insects, obviously. And one of the insects are the kinds of insects that buzz. And those are particularly bees and hornets and wasps of all kinds. And particularly, we're interested particularly in the native ones, the mason bees, the leafcutter bees, all kinds of different native bees that pollinate our native plants. And I'm not going to play a sound for them now, but I am going to then introduce this whole other world of insects that chirp and trill. And there's a technical term for that, which is to stridulate, which means that they rub their legs and their wings together to make this sound. And I'm just going to briefly play the sound of the katydid, which I was still hearing up until just a few days ago. And you will be familiar certainly with that sound living in this neck of the woods in late summer and into fall. So we've got birds, two types of insect sounds, and then of course the sounds of frogs and toads. And there are many kinds around us here. On the upper right, I have a photo of from my backyard of a gray tree frog, and you'll probably recognize this sound. They're quite loud, particularly often in late summer and even early fall. Other local frogs here below that, a wood frog, and then from the bottom up on the left is a American toad, a forgotten now a pickerel frog, and then a green frog at the top. I'm going to just recommend that if you're interested in frogs, Frog Watch USA is a great organization. They actually train people to listen for frogs, to distinguish them and help record them for scientific sort of citizen science purposes. So the one thing about the natural sounds, and I think I alluded to this earlier, is that they can actually serve a bit like a canary in the coal mine, in the sense that the absence of them or changing patterns of them actually can be a good predictor of pollution or changes in the weather. And that's starting to become a real factor now with climate change. So soundscape ecology is the study of the soundscape, and it's not just individual sounds, it is the study of all of those sounds, the sounds of geophony, biophony, and anthrophony, and the way that they relate to each other and how we affect each other. And we've just seen a number of examples of things like that. Bernie Krause likes to talk about the soundscape as studying a narrative of a place. The air thrums with stories. There is so much that we can learn about our environment, so many stories, so much information, if we listen to what we're hearing and not just concentrate on what we're seeing or smelling, for example. And obviously there's lots of things that affect soundscape ecology, biodiversity, humans, climate, etc. But I would advocate that if we all became amateur soundscape ecologists, I think we would all become better stewards of the natural world. So I'm going to now just go through how you can encourage more wildlife to come into your yard, particularly the wildlife that is going to make that beautiful chorus for you. First thing that you can do, and we're going to go into each of these in a little more detail, is to plant wisely. If you build it or plant it, they will come, I can assure you. There are other inducements that you can add. Definitely avoid the pesticides and herbicides and things that can either deter, harm, or kill creatures. And maybe think a little bit of how you might reduce your own sound print. And then a few ideas about how you might practice mindful listening to appreciate the natural chorus a little bit more. So first of all, just thinking about how to plant to encourage the natural world to come in and start producing sounds. I have to admit that the picture here is not of a very creature that makes a lot of sound. I suppose if you had a microphone up, you would hear a lot of munching, but it's just a particularly beautiful caterpillar, and it was right outside my front door on a goldenrod. I believe this is the caterpillar of a brown hooded owlet moth. The moth doesn't look like much, but this caterpillar certainly does. So the first thing that you can do, and all of you who are interested in native plants and on the pollinator pathway will know this very well, which is to really think about choosing native plants. I'm not saying exclusively, but if you have I think Doug Tallamy, who you've probably heard of, has written a number of wonderful books. Nature's Best Idea is, or sorry, Best Hope is the most recent one. Bringing Nature Home before that. He talks a lot about having something like 70% of the biomass of your yard being native, but remembering that that would include trees. Oak trees in particular are wonderful. Native fauna and native flora evolve together. So if we plant native plants, they have things that they can both use for nectar and food, and so lay their eggs on so that their young will have something to eat and grow up on. Good idea to diversify your plantings. Different animals, different birds and insects like different kinds of plants. And when you're thinking about diversifying, also think about diversifying by season. Maybe having berries that are available early in the season and ones that might last, like say holly, through the winter. So think about offering a diversity of plants for different kinds of creatures and through different periods of time. Think about layering. In nature, it's not just flat and then trees. We have all sorts of layers of sort of ground cover, and then shrubs and bushes and trees, and different animals dwell in different parts of different layers of the natural world. If you're a birder, for example, you can think of an ovenbird skulking around in the leaf litter under the bushes, or a scarlet tanager way up in the trees, and the only way you can see it is because it's such that beautiful brilliant red color. So think about layering too. Importantly, think about reducing your lawn. Lawn is like a green desert. There's little to no biodiversity. There's no shelter or food, or very little food for animals and birds. So really think about reducing the amount of lawn that you have in your yard. And then think about allowing part of your yard to be a little more densely planted. All of these creatures really appreciate the shelter that bushes, shrubs, snags, roosting places can provide for them. So all of these things, if you can think about when you're planting your yard, or you're going to go out in the spring to plant, you might want to consider introducing some of these aspects into your yard or garden. And just quickly, if you have any reservations about the native plants and their beauty, I hope these pictures will sort of allay any of those reservations. Native plants and flowers are as beautiful, if not more beautiful, than any in the world. In terms of the additional inducements, one of the most important ones is to provide water in your yard. This can be anything from little plates of water, shallow containers, to deeper tubs. You might have bird baths. I just recently put in a pond, you'll see that. And if you're lucky to have vernal pools or wetlands on your property, protect them and don't disturb them. If you are putting out bird baths and plates, just make sure that you clean them at least once a week to keep them free of any kind of organisms or germs that might be bad for animals. Water is really important for amphibians, for example. They don't drink water through their mouth, they absorb it through the skin. They need to have water. They need to be in damp or wet places. And of course, birds love it, especially when the weather is particularly dry. Also think about ways that you can help provide shelter. We talked about that in layering the plants earlier. You can do things like providing a tote boat. I'm going to show you pictures of that in another slide. There are things like bee hotels for some of these native pollinators that we want to encourage into our yards. Nesting boxes and even roosting pouches, and leaving some of those snags and wood piles in places where you won't be able to see them perhaps, or your neighbor won't, but the creatures of nature will be able to benefit from their presence. Of course, many of you, probably like I do, have a bird feeder. That's a great way to bring birds into your yard. Just again, make sure that you do clean it regularly. and to supply perches. Birds and dragonflies, it turns out, really love little perches in the yard, and you get to see them a lot more when you have those. So in my yard, I sort of graduated from, let me just go back here, from just these little sort of plates on my patio to a pot, and then ultimately I put in a little pond. And in that pot here, this French sort of tub, I should say, that I think last year I had something like 13 frogs in there at once. So they really appreciate it. And it doesn't have to be sort of right flat, even to the ground. They are willing to jump up and get into it if you supply water. And again, just some more shots from my own yard. The chipmunks like it. The mourning doves like it. And this is the pond that I put in last year. The most recent visitor to it was a mink that I saw go in and come out a few times. And unfortunately, he was actually taking some of the frogs in there. So I ended up chasing him away. But it was, I have to say, quite a lovely sight to see that mink in the yard and in that pond. And so this map just briefly shows you, gives you an example of the impact of the presence of water and sound. So this was produced by the same folks who produced the map earlier that showed how loud things were. This, and it combined human sounds as well as natural sounds. This map actually predicts how much sound there would be without human sound on a sort of typical summer day. And so it's just the sounds of nature. And what's particularly interesting is that it is most quiet in the areas here that are the driest. And the areas that are the darkest blue, like Florida, the Mississippi River Valley, you can even see here the Hudson River coming down, and a few other areas where there is more lush plant life and more water. There definitely tends to produce a lot more sound. So bring some water into your yard and I can assure you, you will get some more sound as well. For native bees, some of our solitary bees, you might want to consider putting up a bee hotel. This is not mine. This is a particularly deluxe example, but you can get far simpler ones, and they're pretty easy to make as well. And this encourages the solitary native bees to come and take up residence in your backyard. I mentioned toad abodes earlier. These actually work for frogs too. There's lots of different ways. I actually leave sort of rolled up bark to attract toads and frogs around the pond, and they like to use it to find shelter. As you can see, you can use upturned pots or create a little one made out of stones, and it really helps frogs and toads find shelter and keep moist on particularly in the middle of summer. And there again is the edge of my pond with some green frogs waiting to go into the bark toad abode that I had put out. Perches, you can see I've got a whole bunch of different places here that I use for gardening and hummingbird feeders, but unfortunately I didn't have one that had birds on them, but typically those are just full of birds and dragonflies during the summertime, during the summer months. Then I want to talk just briefly about what you can do or what you should consider avoiding to help bring the voices of nature to your yard. We talked about this earlier. Obviously, eliminating pesticides, herbicides, even synthetic fertilizers. You will be surprised to discover that once you do that, you'll have much more biodiversity, many more insects, and many of those beneficial insects will take care of many of the insects that you may find munching away on your garden. And I would also add that I think we should all maybe consider being a little bit more comfortable with having leaves on our plants that have a few holes in them, because that actually means that you've got a really healthy garden. Keep an eye on pets. Dogs and cats can sort of wreak havoc with the denizens of the natural world coming into the yard. I mean, probably most people know that cats, and usually unowned sort of feral cats it is, are responsible for killing between 1 billion and 4 billion birds every year. So if you have a cat, keep it inside. I have one and I love her, but I do keep her inside. Um, Minimize that disturbance of any wetlands or vernal ponds or backyard pools that you have. Just let them be, essentially. And don't add non-native frogs or turtles or fish. Not only do they eat some of the frogs and their eggs, but they also can carry a disease to our native frogs and toads. And then consider cutting the lights. It turns out that lights are at night can be quite harmful to insects. And I won't go into any more detail on that, but that's becoming an interesting area of study. And then I just want to encourage you to consider reducing perhaps your own sound print. Maybe you could mow a little bit less. If you have less lawn, you won't have to mow as much. If you do mow, and we certainly do, I do, my husband does, maybe you could consider, just consider, and I'm not saying you need to do all of these things, a non-gas powered machine. I think typically electric lawnmowers produce about 95 decibels of sound, whereas gas-powered ones produce about 90. I think I should have said 75 if I didn't. That was the electric one. Gas-powered is 90, and that's as loud as a rock concert. Leave the leaves. Leaf blowers are really loud, and as any of you know who are on the pollinator pathway, leaving the leaves is a really good thing for overwintering insects and other creatures. And if you've got an outdoor sound system, well, maybe just consider enjoying the chorus of nature instead. And there really is some truth in the fact that as we start to tune into nature and listen more carefully and become more aware of it, we may be more likely to make wiser decisions about the natural world and our role as stewards of it. You might want to consider a mindfulness practice. And by the way, I have sheets to hand out after this on all of these things. So I'm just going to hurry through this so we'll have time for a few questions. You might want to sort of count the kind of sounds that you hear in a specific period of time, maybe the ones you like and then the ones that you don't, and think about how they make you feel and perhaps what you could do about it. There's a wonderful article in a magazine called Emergence Magazine, and it's just a recent one called The 5 Practices for Listening to the Languages of Birds. I won't go into that now, but if you get a chance, it's really quite a wonderful article. And there's some really interesting sort of neat tips to think about what you can do to sort of fine tune your ear. You might think about going for a sound walk. An early sort of soundscape acoustical ecologist, R. Murray Schafer, who's also a musician, really encouraged people to go for sound walks, to actively listen to what you're hearing. Maybe if you've got kids, you could get them to go on a scavenger hunt and listen for different types of sounds. And it is believed that the more aware we become of our noise and sound pollution, that we'll be more effective at diminishing that noise pollution, and it may be even more effective than ordinances against it. So I just want to remind you, in the words of W.B. Yeats, that the world is full of magic things patiently waiting for our senses to grow sharper. So really think about ways, things that I've mentioned, ones that you come up with where you can start to listen in particular and sharpen that sense of listening. This is a particular sound that is just so gorgeous. It's a wood thrush. If you ever get a chance to hear it, you're really blessed. And again, Bernie Krause, the man that I've been mentioning, he's written a wonderful book called The Great Animal Orchestra. If you get a chance to read it, I highly recommend it. And also, if you get a chance, he has about a 15-minute TED Talk that is really worth listening to. If you just Google TED Talk Bernie Krause, it's a great, great talk. So just to really briefly recap, just think about listening plant native plants, minimize the lawn, maybe hold off on the chemicals, or really do hold off on the chemicals, add some water shelter, reduce your sound print, take a deep breath and listen, and then listen again. So that's the end of my talk. I just want to quickly walk you through a few resources. And again, I have a sheet that we can send around to you. Lots of great places to come up with lists of native plants. Pollinator-pathway.org, which I work with. The Audubon has a great list of plants. Lots of places you can go to find native plants that you can buy. And there are many places around here, or actually more and more, that you can actually buy native plants. Here is a list of books. In addition to Bernie Krause, there are the Doug Ptolemy books. Other resources as well online. Again, these will be listed on that handout. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology, if you want to listen to birds and learn bird songs, has great resources there. And I've recently just discovered this National Park Service page, and it has all kinds of fabulous information about sound preservation and understanding sound. So if you get a chance to go to that, I really highly recommend that as well. And then I just want to thank you and let the natural world thank you as well for listening. These are the spring peepers I mentioned earlier. And if you're listening in the early and mid-spring, you're going to hear lots of those outside of your yard. So with that, I will stop talking. And I haven't left a whole lot of time for questions, but if we do have a few, I'd be happy to take them.
Okay, Cathy, I do see one question here from Jean. What are the needs of frogs and toads to overwinter successfully?
Leslie?
Did you hear? Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Cathy?
Let's see. Leslie?
Can you hear me?
I'm just going to go to the chat now and see if I can get that going.
So can you hear me, Cathy, or not? Seems like you can't.
Leslie?
Yes, can you hear me? You can't hear me? Okay. You want to look in the Q&A? I'll chat. Hold on.
I'm going to assume that people can hear me.
Yes, we can.
And I don't think we have too many questions, but one of them was about the needs of frogs and toads for overwintering successfully. I think I was showing you some pictures of some of the water sources that I have provided in my yard. And what I discovered when I put the pond in is that if you're going to build a pond, it's a good idea to make it at least 18 inches deep and perhaps even 2 feet. Frogs, many kinds of frogs will actually burrow into the bottom of the leaf matter and the earth in the bottom of a pond. And in order to avoid being frozen, they need to be a certain depth below the level, so the surface level. So if you do have your own pond, or if you're considering putting one in, I'd suggest making it at least 18 inches deep. But in terms of providing shelter, frogs are pretty good, and toads, about finding their own shelter and knowing when it's time to seek shelter, whether it's to go underwater or to dig deep under the leaf matter. So the more that you can actually leave some leaf matter, some leaves, that's good for some toads and frogs as well. If you do have say a tub of water like the one that I showed you that's not that deep, You might want to consider emptying it and removing the frogs to a deeper pool. I had to do that a couple of years in a row just to make sure that they didn't freeze. But again, you can generally let nature look after itself. I didn't see any other questions. With that, I am going to I'm just going to thank everybody for coming. I hope I haven't gone on too long. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Leslie or Lori at the Ridgefield Library. I believe this has been recorded, so it will be available. And I do have a resource sheet as well as just a quick overview of tips that just covers some of the things that you can do to bring nature and to bring those beautiful sounds into your own yard. So thanks very much for joining. And remember, this is part of a series that the Ridgefield Library is starting. Jackie Elgon will be talking about invasives, and I've heard her talk. It's absolutely wonderful. So make sure that you tune into that. And it has just been confirmed for me that it has been recorded. And I do have a question here about the handout, the resource list. Leslie or Lori will be sending that around to folks who have signed up, so you can get a hold of it then. So thank you to everybody, and have a happy Thanksgiving and stay safe and well. Thank you all.